Swami, always a pleasure having you with us here in ET. Now, Swami, of course, will be leading our budget programming over the next 10 odd days. Swami, first up, 8 days now for the budget. What's your sense? Do you think the finance minister this time, what is he going to pick between fiscal prudence and populism? Is it safe to assume it will be a budget that's being prepared to meet the red line on fiscal deficit?
I hope so, but I'm not sure. I think India needs not just one tough, but two tough budgets in a row to set the fisc in order. After that, the next 3 years will become easier. So I think the right way to do is two tough budgets followed by three much easier budgets. Congress went, if you remember, just the other way around. UPA started with two very soft budgets. And then when it tried to tighten up, it got into all kinds of trouble and ultimately it got electorally slammed. So I think Jaitley needs to recall that and say, look, achhe din aayenge. I agree, but the situation is so difficult. Bear with me. We need to be tough for the first 2 years. I know this may seem ungrateful. We need to have some bitter medicine right now. And I promise you, this will then result in 3 much better years. This is what he needs to do. Whether he'll have the guts to say so openly, whether he will avoid populism altogether, that I think is more doubtful. Because if you see what happened in the railway budget, I mean, what they were proposing was not even their own. It was just a UPA rail budget proposal, which the railway minister put forward. And when people said, how can you be so tough? Far from saying that we need bitter medicine, they said, no, don't blame me. This is just the UPA's folly. I mean, this does not sound like a government that is serious about combating populism or serious about administering bitter medicine. So I think the indications are that we will get perhaps not quite as loose a kind of budget as we had under the UPA. But are we going to get a really tough budget? I wish that is the case, but I doubt whether that will actually happen.
All right. Sher ki surat, khargosh ka kaleja is what you wrote in Sunday's papers and perhaps mirroring that opinion. But Swami, very quickly, when Chidambaram curtailed the deficit at under 4.8% of the GDP, questions were raised about the quality of fiscal consolidation. Do you believe Jaitley can really keep his promise with 4.1%? If he indeed does slip, how much do you expect him to slip by?
Yes, the question is, the 4.1, lots of people said this was quite unrealistic. It assumed a 19% growth of revenues, which really, frankly, was unrealistic when your GDP projection was only 13%. So if you begin to look a little more realistically at the figures, you might say that the actual fiscal deficit actually realistically would be closer to 4.6 rather than 4.1. So where do we go from there? Okay, there are two ways he can get it back to 4.1. Number one, a lot of expenditures spilled over from last year. He said, instead of paying them in March, I'll pay them in April. This is a piece of financial jugglery of whether you go from, as I say, a cash system to an accrual system or not. Jaitley can do a reverse jugglery, reverse some of these items back into the previous year's budget. Then the previous year's deficit will go up from 4.6 to 5. And correspondingly, there will be more leeway in the current year. Secondly, I think he can definitely aim for a much more ambitious disinvestment target. At the time that the interim budget was presented, the capital market was still very iffy. There were no animal spirits out there. Now there has been a veritable boom and there are any number of takers. So I think, Jaitley could aim for a really big, massive figure.
Swami, very often a lot of people say that finance ministers fret way too much over fiscal deficit. Do you believe this fetish is really justified? And do you also believe the finance minister should actually allow himself some amount of fiscal slippage if it's, of course, done in the quest of reviving growth?
I think if Jaitley can say, I am going to focus on the revenue deficit rather than the fiscal deficit. The truth is the revenue deficit by now should have been 0. It's still more than 3. In fact, the realistic figure might be 3.5. If Jaitley says that I am going to get my revenue deficit all the way down to 2%. So, if I'm increasing capital expenditure to take the fiscal deficit to 4.5, that is a good quality spending. I think it's possible to take that kind of approach. But within that kind of approach, what it means is that you're taking a very aggressive attitude towards various kinds of spending, especially subsidies, saying I'm substantially pruning subsidies and improving the quality of my spending. Therefore, it should be a good budget, even if the fiscal deficit is high, provided the revenue deficit really comes down.
Okay, more important to manage the revenue deficit than the fiscal deficit. Swami, quick last question. Much has changed in the last 30 days, and I'm not talking about the change in government, which has improved the sentiment, but two important factors. One, weak monsoon and the geopolitical turmoil in Iraq have come up, and both are going to hit the economy adversely because this will mean higher expenditure revenues are as it is under pressure, like you pointed out. What elbow room does Jaitley have to announce growth-boosting measures? What could they be?
I think Jaitley should ignore both those events. It is, I think, entirely possible that we will have serious drought. It is also possible that with the monsoon showing some signs of revival, that it will be a subnormal monsoon, but not a serious drought. As far as the Middle Eastern situation is concerned, yes, things have got particularly bad in Iraq, and yet it can be argued that things have got almost as bad as they can actually get, and they will now get better. We have reached a situation where there is no oil production in northern Iraq at all. That surely can be reversed by the end of the year, and at least part of the oil production from the Kurdish areas can go back to Turkey. So as far as I can see, the situation has got very bad on those two fronts. I don't think it's going to get even worse. It may get somewhat better. Therefore, I would say that as of now, Jaitley should not make provisions. And later on, let's see how the year goes. If things get really bad, then he can bring in a supplementary budget which makes some other changes. As of now, I would not assume the worst. I would say that things are not going to get much worse.
Swaminathan Aiyar, thanks very much for breaking down the big budget, the big reset for us right here on ET Now. And for you, the viewer, we'll continue to get you Swaminomics in our run-up to the budget every night here on Business Tonight till, of course, the 10th of July.